Is our government a single hierarchy of authority? The county a subset of the state a subset of the federal government? That seems to be the way most people perceive it. And that's the way it looks on a flowchart. But is that really how it works, going up and down? Hello again, and welcome to the County Seat. I'm Chad Booth. Today we are going to look at how governments communicate and work with each other, particularly what that connection is between your local county and Washington. We begin by looking at the different ways counties and the federal government touch each other in the course of their duties, in the basics.
Why does my county commissioner, councilman, or sheriff have to trot off to Washington at taxpayer expense all the time? After all, aren't our elected congressmen and senators in charge of making federal law, while our commissioners are in charge of creating county ordinances? That is true in a sense. Commissioners and councilmen only have the power to create ordinances, but they do have the power and obligation to influence other laws which will impact their constituents. Their legal responsibility is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of county citizens. Congress is often debating legislation that has huge impacts on local communities, but they are so far away from Main Street that they can't see the impact that laws have when they are implemented. And with so many voices from lobbyists and special interests, local government should be involved if your sheriff, councilman, or commissioner is going to look after your welfare as a citizen. A perfect example of that is if Washington introduces a new law that had the potential to bankrupt a county, the county representatives should have their voices heard. Whether it's unfunded mandates, changes in Medicaid, or conflicts between local and federal law enforcement, things that happen in Washington affect Utah, and our congressional delegation needs the input from local on-the-ground leaders to make sure they are representing all of the local constituents. But perhaps more important than the legislative side of the equation is the relationship with regulatory entities. Regulations are created by policymakers who are not elected, have no connections to the local people, who sometimes live on the other side of the country. According to a recent article in Forbes magazine, there were 115 new laws passed by Congress in 2015, at an average of 15 pages per law for a total of around 1,700 pages of new statutory law. On the other hand, the Federal Register added 82,036 new pages into their books, of which around 27,000 of those were new regulations. Those regulations can impact a community the same way a law does. It's almost impossible to change a regulation once it's passed, but there are often hearings where these regulations are being planned and discussed. If local officials are at the table, they can have some effect on those proposed regulations. So there are legitimate reasons our local representatives travel to Washington to represent us. Without those trips, the communication between federal and local would grow further apart. What are we currently doing to close that gap of communication? We will find out in our discussion today on the County Seat. I'm Maggie Kay.
Mountains to explore. Adventure to be had. A town to fall in love with. Yes, all that in Park City, Utah. Start planning your fall adventure at visitparkcity.com.
The Utah Farm Bureau began as a collection of farmers supporting each other to raise the food we enjoy. Today, Farm Bureau membership encompasses everyone, whether ranchers, growers, or just everyday folks like you and me. Members enjoy discounts on items like vehicles and ATVs, or insurance that's very affordable. You don't have to be a farmer to join, and dues are small, but together we make a big difference in keeping our food supply local and abundant. Join Utah Farm Bureau.
For 7 years, Utah's Community Voice has been the County Seat, a program that looks beyond politics to spotlight the issues and stories that really matter to you and your community. Now you can help set Utah's agenda for the future by joining the conversation. Become a County Seat sponsor and help support those conversations that are critical to the future of state government. Contact us at 801-947-8888 to make your contribution to help the voice of Utah be heard like never before.
What would you do with an extra day in Utah Valley? Explore the Wasatch Mountains? Snap a family photo at Bridal Veil Falls. Cool off on Utah Lake or the Provo Rivers. No matter what you're searching for, you can find it in Utah Valley. Bring everyone together.
Welcome back to the county seat. We are continuing our conversation talking about the importance of a direct connection, a relationship between local government and Washington, both the elected officials and the administration. Joining us for our conversation part of the show is a commissioner from Sevier County here in the town of Richfield, Tudor Ogden. Thank you, Commissioner, for joining us.
Good to be here.
And Russ Cowley, who is the executive director of the 6 County Association of Governments down here. So we appreciate your taking the time for this conversation. I would like to talk about the tools in the toolbox for the counties to have a direct connection with Washington. I know several counties chip in to hire a lobbyist that serves in Washington to try and keep pushing local county issues. But there are also a lot of other tools, associations you belong to. Could you kind of give us a rundown of that?
Well, I'll start out, Chad. One of the things that we've been involved with is going back to Washington and actually taking our commissioners and our board members back to Washington to have them actually sit down with our congressional members, talk about the issues that are important to them. One of the things that happened with me long ago is that as we went back to that Washington trip, there's an organization that we belong to called the National Association of Development Organizations. It's kind of a partner with the National Association of Counties, but it's for executive directors to understand more about how to deal with Washington and work with our programs. And as we have gone back to that organization and had the opportunity to actually go out and work with those folks on how bills are written and even get involved with the writing of bills. And so it's been very, very nice to be able to have the support of county commissioners that will allow us as their employees to go back and actually become educated on those kind of issues.
You've got the Western Intermountain region of the National Association of Counties, WIR and NACO. How do they help interface in this whole Washington mess? Because apparently your visits when you go on these NACO Washington junkets are not necessarily just to our elected delegations. You meet with all kinds of people.
Yes, you do. You'll meet with people, obviously with WIR, that is the Western regional side of the United States. And we have a lot more in common with the Western states. So when we have that convention, you are able to meet with your other elected officials and those who are representatives of us in that board, and try to get a unified voice when you go to NACO, which is the whole United States. Mm-hmm. And then at that time, you're able to go forward and at that time make legislation that hopefully will have some power, because now you're unified with the Western states and also with NACO going forward when you're back making rules. So
have those associations been able to open some administrative doors as well as legislative? I know the bill making process is very messy, much more messy than at the county level. But have they made an impact as far as working with the Department of Interior, the EPA, and groups like that? Does that connection help?
It definitely helps. And one thing that I may say for our 6 County Association of Governments, our board has always been very supportive of sending folks back to Washington. And I have been very amazed at how important it is for a county commissioner to actually have that experience of going back to Washington. And as Commissioner Ogden says, actually sitting down with a member and talking about their issues and their concerns. It means a lot to them. And I might just mention also that as we go through the process, we have the congressional members, staff come to our meetings. They have that networking with those folks every month. And then as we go back to Washington, they're very good to help us with any issues we have as we go back to meet with the member themselves.
Do you think you've turned any heads? I mean, do you think there have been guys in Tennessee or North Carolina that all of a sudden start to understand Western issues because of the efforts of NACO and WIR and your junkets back to Washington?
What's fascinating about that is if you go back and you get involved with some of those organizations, and as I mentioned with the NATO organization, I was able to be on the board and a few of those things. And what was funny about it is I would go back and they knew I was from Utah. And the first thing that they would always say to me is that they'd say, okay, Mr. Cowley, tell us about public lands, because I was always bringing up the public lands issue of this area. And so we've actually had the opportunity of bringing those folks back here on this congressional briefing, and it's been very interesting to get their reaction. It's something they haven't ever seen before. They don't understand public lands, and as you start explaining that to them and actually give them an on-the-ground experience, it's funny to watch their demeanor change. And so it's a great opportunity.
Is that something you think we need to do more of, is actually getting them from Washington out here so they can see it firsthand? Is there something lost in the translation of you telling them about the problem and them seeing it?
Yeah, very much so. You know, we're trying to be managed by people in Washington that's 2,000 miles away, and a lot of these folks have never even been out here on the federal lands. As you know, Chad, obviously we're about 76% federal lands, and a lot of these people in the East, they don't understand that at all because they have very little federal land or very little input on their federal land. So we're trying, and we continue to try to get more involved with the people in the East. That's one thing with NACO. Go back there and you try to get with some of these folks, the other commissioners from the East, try to explain to them what our concerns and what our issues are. We try to get onto these committees, and so that we can make an impact, try to get them to understand what's going on here in the West.
Will that solve some of your problems as a 6-county AG? I mean, I know sometimes you go to the Department of Interior for grants and things like that for your counties. In fact, I'd like to spend just a little bit of this time talking about that part of the relationship, in the fact that you, because of the, you know, we've got PILT issues, we've got grants, we've got things like that. What is that part of that connection with Washington directly with counties?
Well, you know, if we're not fighting for the rights of our area, nobody else is. Mm-hmm. And so what we've been talking about is building those relationships, and, you know, to have that office closer to actually where the lands are would make that a lot easier for the commissioners. I mean, how many trips do you guys go on back, you know, to Washington just to present an idea, or to have to go back and represent one of their proposals for one of their public land issues? And if it was in or here in Utah, they wouldn't have to drive that far, and this is where it's all taking place anyway.
I guess a Wyoming rancher wouldn't have that much trouble getting there to a hearing or anything like that.
No,
be a little easier.
But what's really interesting about what you're talking about is you take PILT and SRS, you take that funding source away from the counties, and we have counties that would probably go bankrupt. And you think about some of those counties that have 97% public, you know, lands. That's very difficult for them to make up a difference of PILT.
Is that money, Tudor, that is direct money, direct from the federal government to the county? That's not like filtered through a state or a region?
No,
or anything like
it
that.
comes right directly to the county. We get about $1,900,000 a year. Obviously, if that translates into acres and dollar-wise, it's about $1.80 per acre for Sevier County. Which is minimal for all of the work that we have to do out there. We have search and rescue that has to, you know, go out and help assist people when they have accidents or problems on the federal land. It's important that we have that. There's 49 states in the United States that receive some sort of a PILT payment, and that's payment in lieu of taxes. Obviously, we continue to battle that, because a lot of these counties, like Russ has mentioned, they rely heavily on that. We put that into our budget every year, and then we have to ask Washington, you know,
to live up to the commitment.
Live up to the commitment of that PILT payment.
So is that $1.80 a lot less than Joel Hatch would, or Jensen, or what was that she would pay for an acre of rangeland that she owns outright?
Sure. Your green belt is about $1.50 an acre, If we could even get the government to come up to pay $1.50 an acre, that would be substantial for all of these counties. What we'd really like to see is go back to management of the forests. That's what was originally taking place before the PILT was introduced, is they had to make their forests pay their way. Mm-hmm. And that goes back to the logging, it goes back to the grazing, it goes back to managing the forest and going forward. So,
well, there's some headway that should and can be made in that particular area. I kind of want to finish up this conversation by talking about we've gotten pretty good with some of the events that you hold of actually getting our local delegation out there. Do we need to get guys from South Carolina out here on the ground?
Yes.
How do we do? And how do you think? How are you going to bribe them to get here?
Feed them a big beef steak.
Well, that's one thing that's been fascinating about our congressional ride. You know, a lot of people go out and they bring folks out and they'll put them on a golf course. We put them on ATVs. And it's been amazing when we've tried to encourage folks from back east to come out here, that ATV ride is something that really intrigues them. And so we have been successful in bringing some staff from other organizations, other congressional members on the Democratic side, for example. We tell them we're not going to convert them to be a Republican. We just want them to see what public lands is really about. And we'll give you an ATV ride, and that encourages them to come out. And we can talk more about that little experience. But no, it's been really good that way. And I think if we can continue to encourage that kind of activity and have something to bring folks out that's attractive, that I think we can bring people out here. And that's what we're working towards more all the time.
Well, this has been most enlightening. And in case people are wondering what this congressional ride is all about that the 6 counties has been engaged in, we're going to tag along, and we're going to do that when we come back on the county seat.
In a place that is beyond words, there is nothing to be said, except take your time in Bryce Canyon country.
There's a little place on a Utah map where I was raised, where my heart's at, where the sagebrush grows wild and high, and the stars come out at night. In the basin with a Ute reservation, skiing starvation, that Duchesne County life.
This is what adventure looks like, and here's what it sounds like. Southwest Utah's Iron County offers some of the most iconic trails within the state that include 200 miles of new trails to be discovered. Check out ironcounty.net for info and interactive maps for your complete guide to off-roading. Explore countless miles of trails in the heart of Dixie National Forest, the gateway to Utah National Parks, Iron County.
Welcome back to the county seat. Have you ever been in a conversation with someone and you're trying to explain something that you saw and finally in exasperation you quip, well, you just had to be there? That happens often when you're trying to explain the effects of government policy on a local community, whether you're at the state capitol or in Washington. So to paint a better picture to policymakers, a group of county governments started taking state and federal officials out to the problem, just so they could be there. 22 years later, that effort is still paying off, as we discover in our On the Ground segment.
we've invited our legislators back to visit our county so we can show them our problems with getting things done that we need done by the legislators.
Just for one of our guests, we are 4/5 the size of Massachusetts.
Well, we had a good ride today, about, 75, 80 people on side-by-sides and four-wheelers on the Fillmore Loop, the Paiute Trail, and I can tell you it's been a great chance to see a good part of our national forest and to learn about what we're going to have to do to protect our forest here and to create more economic development opportunities in some of our more rural counties.
The main impetus behind the governor's roadless rule petition is to get in and do active management so that we can have better watersheds, cleaner air. I was coming through Spanish Fork this morning and you had to cut the air with a knife.
My name is Zach George. I'm a legislative assistant at the National Association of Counties. I assist our lobbyists on environment, energy, and land use issues. And getting the opportunity to come out here and really see some of the land use issues up close and personal, you know, not being in Washington, D.C. and coming here and seeing it in person has just been an extraordinary experience.
We brought them out here to show them our land so that they know how 90% of our property owned by the government affects us.
Well, you know, in an event like this, you get a chance to talk to a lot of commissioners and folks responsible for the preservation of our natural resources. But one of the areas that was very interesting was listening to someone who helps manage a large ranch operation. And grazing cattle are one of the elements that we can use to fight wildfires.
But I think that a lot of that stuff could be avoided by managing. And I think there's so many people out there that have the wrong idea about cattle and don't think that there's a benefit.
We had a great turnout today. It's a good event and a lot of knowledge from different people that we haven't talked to before. It really helped us a bunch to know where we stand, and I think we helped them to know where they stand with us. Great turnout.
You know, I think it's helpful to bring people here from the nation's capital. We've got congressmen here, we've got members of the staff of people in Washington. They need to see our public land. They need to understand what's going on in our public land, to understand why it is it's so important for us to thin the forests, to be able to graze on the land, to have multiple use so the people of Utah and the country can take advantage of these extraordinary resources. And that's hard to do if you're just sitting at a desk in Washington. You imagine everything is Bryce National Park. Well, there are millions and millions and millions of acres that are more than just Bryce National Park, and they need to be thoughtfully managed. And that's something which hopefully will continue to be better understood by the people in D.C. as they come on outings like this.
The Six-County Association of Governments, who oversees the annual event, tells us that they have played no favorites on where to take these rides. By the year 2020, each county in the group will have hosted the event 3 times. The largest group to ever show up was the most remote location as well, which created quite a logistical challenge. It was at Notch Peak in Millard County with 103 ATV riders. We'll be right back with some closing thoughts.
All local products have a story of magical places, real people, and delicious recipes spanning generations. So go ahead and discover flavors you've never tasted and friends you never knew you had. Utah's own Discover Local Food.
Antelope Island State Park. Think of it as a treasure island because of the unique activities and treasured experiences you'll enjoy there. Join the fun and excitement of the National Parks Band overlooking White Rock Bay on Saturday, September 22nd. Bring your chairs and friends to Antelope Island State Park for a beautiful evening concert by the National Parks Band. Tickets at friendsofantelopeisland.com. Discover nature, buffalo, historic Gar Ranch, and more at Antelope Island State Park. Visit plaindavis.com/antelope today.
Look south to adventure. Look south to beauty. Look south to San Juan County. Out here, the road goes on forever, and what you'll find will change how you see the world. Climb on your OHV and discover forgotten landscapes and vistas that challenge the imagination. From Blanding and Monticello to the cliff faces of Monument Valley, we're open and ready for you to explore. San Juan County, Utah's Canyon Country.
Too often we find ourselves in shoes like these, or these. Wouldn't it be nice to change into something more like this, or this? How about these? Put on whatever shoes you prefer and come to Beaver County. We have exactly the adventure you need to put under them. So the next time you want to change out of these, come to Beaver County where you can jump into a pair of these. Beaver County, Utah. Lace up for adventure.
Welcome back to the county seat. It is surprising how much direct interplay there is between the federal government and our Washington representatives and the counties. Of course, most of the attention goes to the policy side, with frequent trips to meet with congressional delegations from our state and possibly others. But there have been frequent trips where county officials have been needed to smooth out regulatory bumps with the different federal agencies whose administrative regulations have direct impact on life here at home. Now, often, those visits by your local officials are the most important of all. You see, federal regulators in the executive branch never are held accountable directly to the people they regulate, as they're not elected. Frequently, the people making policy aren't even appointees of the White House, so there's almost no accountability for the harm their policies may and can do to a local community. The only way to address this inequity is to have local governments engage with regulators face to face. So when your county commissioner flies to Washington on business, don't assume that they're there for free tours of the Smithsonian. It has been our experience that their agendas are filled with meetings trying to make things better for you at home. It's often easy to look at the time out of the county seat as a county-funded fun trip, but the work they do is necessary and it's important to keeping a far and distant branch of government on the same page as those of us here at home. It's been my experience that counties with leaders who choose to withdraw from interacting with other counties, the state, and the federal peeps on their own turf often lose the very contact and clout they need to advance any agenda healthy to the home team. That's my 2 cents worth for today. Thanks for watching. You can watch this again by visiting our YouTube channel, going to Facebook, or our website. If you follow our social media, you will be able to join the conversation and stay abreast of things happening across the state. We will see you next time on the County Seat.